Thank you very much, first of all, for your invitation, Ambassador So and JPI. Appreciate for your invitation. And it's a privilege and honor to participate in this the meeting. And I'm quite interested in its topics. U.S.-China relations and its impact on the South Korea and the Korean diplomacy. It's quite, and we have 3 sessions actually. Second and third is more bilateral basis, bilateral lectures, but the first one is a little broader one. So maybe we may have the many very interesting topics we can discuss in the first session. I read all the papers presented to these meetings. All the papers seems like U.S.-China competition or confrontation is quite unprecedented. Seems like they have very identical view on that point. The unprecedented in 2 things. First of all, is all-out nature of a confrontation. It's ranging from the military, political, economic, and strategic, and even ideological arena was touched. And Obama administration, or in previous one, is whenever they have the anti-dispute confrontation, but they try to make it their confrontation very localized and isolated one. But this time, they are ready to expand to all the areas I just mentioned. There's one quite different the uniqueness of current U.S.-China competition. One more thing that I noticed is that both the Republican and Democrats in the U.S. politics are supportive of that Trump's very stance, Trump's all-out confrontation with China. Even I think that is demonstrated in even midterm elections in early this month, which means this competition or confrontation will continue for a long time, no matter what compromise they can make. I mean, maybe reach that Trump-Xi Jinping meetings on the occasion of G20. That is the background we have to think of, and that I think will be touched by most of the presenters and the panelists. With those 2, the relationship, U.S.-China relationship, as Koreans, we are very much interested in 2 things. How does confrontation, U.S.-China confrontation will evolve or will develop in the years to come? Not a long-term basis, but at least 3 or 4 years. What will happen? And another point I have to draw your attention, or maybe we Koreans very much interested, is what kind of impact of that U.S.-China confrontation will on Korean policy or Korean situation or Korean, including denuclearization of North Korea. There's 2 points. If you focus on that point, we can have the very the focused discussions. With those 2 points in mind, just I suggest to have the very focused discussions in this session. I will give that 8 to 10 minutes to presentation, to each presentation, and 5 to 7 minutes for panelists. It seems like very short, but as I said, this is is not open to the public. They're all the professionals, so you don't have the explanation of the situations. Just to come to the point. That's where we can save time. We can have the more focused discussions in these sessions. And another point its substance. As I said, we Korea wishes to hear on your point, on your view, the first, how this confrontation or competition will continue in years to come, particularly during the Obama tenure presidency. That's one point. Another point is impact on Korean Peninsula. I stopped here, and I have to introduce each of the presenters and the panelists, but that's the introduction is on the pages, on the page 11, 10, 11, 12, and 13, 14. So I don't have to repeat them. So I will start with Professor Reznick presentation.
Thank you. I'd like to thank JPI for inviting me today to participate in this lovely event. So in coming to trying to come to grips with the Trump administration's foreign policy in general and its policy towards the Asia Pacific specifically, I find myself befuddled as an international relations theorist because I just don't think any of our theories work very well in explaining Trump. I think maybe in this one case, the discipline of psychology, and specifically those who specialize in abnormal psychology, might actually do a much better job in really doing in succeeding in explaining a lot of what this administration does from day to day. But I'm going to try and put America's policy towards China and this region into some kind of context. And the way that I thought of doing so is to sort of recognize that since the Chinese Communist Revolution of 1949, U.S. policy towards China has basically proceeded along two tracks. From the revolution until the Nixon administration, the U.S. pursued a fairly consistent policy of diplomatic and economic estrangement of the PRC, comprehensive economic sanctions combined with a refusal to normalize diplomatic relations or even accept that the government in Beijing was the rightful government of China as opposed to the one in Taipei. And the effort to ring not only China but also the Soviet Union and East Asia with a constellation of U.S. bilateral and multilateral alliances to hem in Chinese adventurism and expansionism. So that takes us to Nixon. Then, of course, 1972, the hardline Republican president goes to China, meets with Mao and Zhou Enlai, and suddenly U.S. policy starts to shift in diplomatic and then later in economic terms by the end of the decade. The U.S. normalizes diplomatic relations with the PRC. It expands economic contacts after Deng Xiaoping's rise to power in the late 70s. And yet, at the same time, the United States hedges its bets by continuing to ring China with a set of perpetuated U.S. bilateral military alliances, strategic partnerships. We see this even though the U.S. is expanding its economic relationship with China into the 90s and 2000s. At the same time, the Clinton administration deploys 2 carrier battle groups in 1996 into the area around Taiwan to deter Chinese aggression against Taipei. And George W. Bush, after coming into office in 2001, gives an interview in which he actually abandons the policy of strategic ambiguity vis-a-vis Taiwan by saying, yeah, if China invaded Taiwan, the U.S. would come to Taiwan's defense. So this policy continues under Barack Obama, most recently under the aegis of the rebalance to Asia, or the pivot to the Asia Pacific. Now, Obama administration officials were adamant that this had nothing to do with the containment of China, but we all know that there would be very little reason other than containing China to undertake the various military elements of the pivot. Even the chief economic element of the pivot, which was the TPP, excluded China. So it's understandable that Chinese leaders, irrespective of Obama administration protestations, would see this as being sort of yet another initiative in which the United States is trying to hem in Chinese military and geopolitical expansion through the region. So that takes us all the way up to the campaign, the presidential campaign of 2016. And Trump, during the campaigns, seemed to want to invert decades of US policy by, on the one hand, stressing the need for enhanced protectionism against China, so ending this sort of 4-decade-long economic engagement of the PRC through expanded trade and investment ties. Trump, as we all know, is railed against the U.S. trade deficit vis-a-vis China, and during the campaign was talked incessantly about the need to raise tariffs, not only against China but also against many other states that run a positive trade balance with the U.S. So on the one hand, Trump wanted to abandon economic engagement with China during the campaign, and yet on the other, he didn't seem to care very much about China's military expansion in the region. In fact, Trump was much harder on American allies in East Asia, South Korea, and on Japan for trade-related reasons, and didn't seem to care very much about, say, Chinese expansionism in the South China Sea. So I don't think this would have been a good policy if it had been implemented, but at least it would have hedged the growing risk of war with China on the one hand with a ameliorated risk of war with China on the other, because by entering into a trade war with China, you're undermining economic interdependence that helps to stabilize the relationship. But on the other, if Trump was willing to appease China in the South China Sea, then that would have avoided military confrontation. Well, soon after assuming office, Trump actually didn't do that. He ended up pursuing a policy towards China that looks, frankly, a lot like the policy the U.S. pursued during the first couple of decades after Mao's revolution. Trump has aggressively, after a short early stint, Trump began to aggressively increase U.S. tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese imports, sparking at least the early stages of what looks to be a trade war with China. And yet, on the other hand, Trump's military posture vis-a-vis the PRC has actually been quite robust. He's dramatically increased military spending over 2 years to the tune of some $200 billion. His White House national security strategy, released late last year, pointedly and explicitly called out China as a revisionist power, using language that previous administrations had shied away from employing. And perhaps most prominently, Trump has doubled the number of freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. So what we're seeing is a sort of back to the future type moment for U.S. foreign policy. At the same time, however, this being Trump, there are all sorts of strange elements of the policy that don't make sense and are somewhat hypocritical. So for instance, by starting a trade war with China, the United States also undermines not only its own economy in the event that this ends up leading to a global recession or economic crisis, but it's also undermining the economies of all of America's close allies and strategic partners in the region. So that is certainly a problem. So I think that this is not a good idea. I'm not a strong proponent of the argument that trade leads to peace, but I don't necessarily want to try and undertake a big experiment on a grand scale of seeing whether protectionism leads to war, because that would probably, that's just not an experiment I care to run. So Trump has also undermined America's position vis-a-vis China by dumping the TPP soon after entering office. So there's one dramatic initiative in which the U.S. could have started to move some of the region's economies away from extreme dependence on China and towards a heightened interdependence with the United States, but he dropped it. So as is the case with all else Trump does, it's very hypocritical, contradictory, and is not easy to reconcile one strand of the policy with another. So going forward, what does this all mean? Well, I think one implication is that the sort of great powers of the region need to do whatever they can to kind of bring the Trump administration back into the fold. Trump has talked periodically about perhaps reopening the TPP, to the consternation of many other members who would rather proceed without the US at this point, but I don't think that's a good idea. I think that any sort of multilateral forum by which the small and middle powers of the region can try and impose some sort of commitment and stability on U.S. policy is a vital necessity. Over the long term, I think Trump is doing the exact wrong things. If we intend to, if the likelihood is that that the U.S.-China competition is a long-term one, and every indication suggests this is going to be a long-term competition. The China has far more economic potential than the old Soviet Union ever did. Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan in the 1930s, Wilhelmine Germany, none of these former great power rivals and peer competitors of the United States had anything close to the economic and military capabilities that China possesses. So this is likely going to, if the Cold War lasted over 4 decades, this could be far longer geopolitical competition. And that means that the United States is going to have to get its economic house in order. This is primarily going to be a geo-economic competition for the time being. And if that's the case, dramatically ramping up contemporary defense spending, passing a $1.5 trillion tax cut that's unnecessary at a time of tremendous economic growth, exploding the U.S. budget deficit, growing the debt, these are all things that I think undermine America's position over the long term if this is going to be a lengthy twilight struggle against China. So doing things like reducing government spending, reducing defense spending, increasing government revenues, lowering the debt, but also taking care of America's rotting infrastructure, its deteriorating pre-secondary education system, its healthcare system, those sorts of things. Those may seem like domestic politics, low politics, unrelated to foreign policy, but I think they're actually intimately related to America's ability to compete with China over the next several decades. And I think I've probably gone over 10 minutes, so I think I'll stop there.
I forgot Professor Resnick is a professor and the coordinator of United States program at the RSIS in Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Actually, we have the 3 presenters, two from Hong Kong, 1 from the Singapore. To my personal experience, I think both Singapore and Hong Kong is the best place to watch, to monitor or to watch the U.S.-China relations. I personally have that experience, so I'm happy today we have the 3 presenters from Hong Kong and Singapore. And to your presentation, I think is quite interesting. Maybe history might repeat, but in not the same fashions as it was in the past. And your suggestion is, to me, first, TPP, but Korea is not part of the TPP, didn't participate in TPP. One more thing, you mentioned the regional, East Asia regional organizations, the regional forum, but President Trump is not coming to attend Singapore East Asian Summit and ASEAN Plus One Summit. And he didn't come. He's not coming to even the APEC, which was known as American Baby. So, and the vice president is coming in his place, and according to a statement from the vice president office, Vice President Pence will promote what? Security dialogue in the Indo-Pacific strategy proposed by President himself last year. Maybe his deputy will promote that idea to ASEAN or other countries. Really, the impact is same as presented by President or Vice President. I don't know. That's big the point we have to watch in the years to come, in the days to come. Now we have second presentation is Professor Zhang. And he is a professor of political science and director of Center for Asian Pacific Studies at Lingnan University. Please.
Well, thank you. I also want to thank Jeju Peace Institute for inviting me to this occasion. I think the issues facing the whole region are truly important because if a new Cold War is going to fully blossom, then everyone else in the region will be implicated. And so, this whether we are seeing a new Cold War, it's debatable, of course. In the title of my presentation, I said the new Cold War and its impacts on South Korea. Whether we have a new Cold War, it is a debatable issue. But I think many features of the current strategic competition between the Trump, U.S. and China start to look like a Cold War. Because the simplest definition of a Cold War is it involves a full spectrum strategic competition in all domains. But the two parties try to manage to avoid direct military conflict. In that sense, I think the United States and China, they are involved in full spectrum competitions. And Trump administration doesn't even want to hide it. They call themselves their new China policy, a full competition policy. Okay? And until recently, the ideological elements in the U.S.-China relations were not really important. Actually, in the early to mid-90s, it was briefly important. After the end of Cold War, when China was no longer a useful strategic ally of the United States in Clinton's first term, partly because of Congress's pressure, ideological factors briefly influenced the Sino-US relations. But it was not important anymore until probably now, as once again indicated by Pence's speech. Maybe they are also going to have an ideological contest. But of course, the U.S. government always denies it. That Pence at the most recent China-U.S. diplomatic and security dialogue in Washington, he said categorically, the United States is not pursuing a Cold War or a containment strategy with China. But of course, whether the Chinese believe it or not, that's a separate issue. I think in my paper I said Trump's first year seemed to project a different kind of rather confused China policy. He periodically indicates that trade was an issue, but at the same time, he and Xi Jinping seem to have a good personal relationship. I think that probably was not due to necessarily confusion of Trump's policy, China policy, but rather it's because of the North Korean issue. In 2017, North Korea's nuclear test and its successful acquisition of intercontinental ballistic missile capabilities start to place North Korean issue at the top of Trump's foreign policy agenda, it seems. And so he needed China's help, and China cooperated, hoping that its assistance to the U.S. could avoid a trade war or wider strategic competition. But once Trump believes that he has solved the problem because he will use his charm, his bargaining deal-making abilities to solve the problems bilaterally with Kim, he started to review, unveil, and start to implement maybe a coherent anti-China agenda. And so throughout 2018, we start to see Trump administration's China policy shifting towards indeed, according to their description, a full competition policy. Started with, it covered everything, economic issues, competition in even Latin America, Central America, it's odd. It looks like a Cold War. Competing anywhere, everywhere. Comprehensive U.S. efforts to stop the loopholes or gaps through which technologies could transfer between two countries. And so it's a containment policy. It's trying to maximize its ability to limit China's future power potential. And so, but of course, people say, what's the difference? Before Trump administration, U.S. government policies always to China always contain a containment element. It's always there. But the previous administration's China policies were more complicated. They always had a containment element, a deterrence element, engagement element, cooperation element, and even limited accommodation element. Okay, like a Bush policy, responsible stakeholders theory. It actually wants to encourage China to play a bigger role, partly to manage China's so-called satisfaction as a rising power. Okay, it's a limited accommodation, but Trump's policies are totally different. It's a competition only. Cooperation is limited to the minimum. Competition is only to avoid the worst outcome, that is military conflict. And so this is the only bright spot in the China-U.S. relations at the moment. The military is still working hard with their Chinese counterparts to avoid military conflict. And they even said at the most recent security dialogue that two countries will create a framework for so-called crisis deconfliction. Crisis deconfliction. And it began to resemble, something like a Soviet U.S. competition in the Cold War era. They compete hard, but they try to avoid military conflicts. They started to introduce a series of mechanisms to prevent direct military conflicts. So what about the future? I think, as Ivan said, the probabilities of something long term. There are two perspectives. One is that from pure structural perspective, that the rise and decline of great powers is always a moment of a contest. And power transition theory predicts that, as that when the power gaps shrinks, competition intensifies, And offensive realists would always predict similar outcomes, Like Dale Copeland has a book called The Causes of Major War, and it says dominant state in relative decline always reverts to full containment postures. Of course, in the past, they also had the preventive war option. Today, it's no longer feasible, but containment becomes the only option to try to preserve their remaining advantages. So offensive realism, power transition theory, they all predict a long-term struggle between two countries. But on the other hand, if we use a different level of analysis and sees foreign policies primarily shaped by state level, unit level factors, then maybe there is still a chance that the conflicts may be moderated. This view says parties, who controls the executive branch, who controls power actually matters. Alternations in political controls do lead to different China policies. And so even though there is a general consensus in the US that the United States facing a more assertive and a more powerful China needs to be tougher, there's no consensus on whether we need to have a Cold War. That is really not in consensus. A lot of elements in the US definitely oppose a full Cold War posture. And but Trump and people who surrounded him, the hawks, Bolton, Bannon, Navarro, Miller, they want a Cold War. Okay, but now they are in charge of the executive branch. They have the power to implement their agenda. But so the issue here is, if they lose the next election, then the next administration may pursue a different policy. For example, if Michael Bloomberg wins the election, his China policy will be quite different. You know? And so and also another factor is over time whether elements in the United States broader society began to push back. We're already seeing that maybe. For example, Peter Navarro just said unregistered foreign agents, Wall Street elites are trying to shape China policy. It's because these people start to push back. You know, they start to influence Trump administration foreign policy from behind the scene. And Navarro worries because his anti-China agenda, containment agenda may fail. He doesn't want a deal between Trump and Xi at the G20 meeting. But those are financial capitalists, those are billionaires, they are working their ways through the system now, you know, and that's why they may have already brokered some kind of a compromise on the trade war issue. So therefore, it's also another possibility that for the remaining terms of Trump administration, his China policy may start to moderate if others start to push back. But the most important issue is whether he will win the next election, you know. And so from this angle, conflict between China and States remains uncertain. You know, the general trend is they may compete harder in the future, but Cold War scenario may not last very long, you know, if Trump loses the next election. Finally, what's the implication for the region? The problem is Cold War, if there's a Cold War, everybody will be implicated because the two so-called superpowers will force people to choose sides, okay? And that's the problem for South Korea and for other countries, you know. And for example, the United States already started to implement via Canada and Mexico, there's a poison pill clause, right? That to have a trade deal with me, you cannot have same thing with China, you know. Will they try to impose this on South Korea or other countries? You know, that's a problem. And also another issue is the facing particularly South Korea is intermediate range missiles. United States, Trump administration withdrew from intermediate range missile treaty because they want to have a similar system to counter China. But people said, where are they going to base it? There are only three places, Japan, South Korea, and Guam. That's it. So once they have that system, will they insist on deploying the missiles in South Korea? You know, they tell South Koreans, right, I protect you, and then you must reciprocate, you know. So that would corner South Korea. So, so if a Cold War can truly blossoms, South Korea will be under pressure, you know, and others will be under pressure, and both China and the United States may try to force them to choose sides. And so what's the solution? During the Cold War, there was a solution, which is the countries who refused to choose sides, they created a non-alignment movement. Specifically, they said, we don't want to choose sides, you know, we're independent, you know. And so in that context, I think South Korea's new southern policy matters, you know, by greater strategic coordination with other countries in the region, with ASEAN, with Australia, they may better be able to withstand pressures from either the United States or China to choose sides, you know. They can better project independent voices and to safeguard their legitimate national interests. And so I think this is something that is should be encouraged. You know, South Korean government definitely should pursue a more vigorous so-called new southern policy, which I think could resemble the previous administration's middle power strategy. You know, middle power strategy is to achieve the same goal, you know, to link up with other similar countries in order to resist pressures from the United States or China, you know, to achieve greater foreign policy autonomy. You know, yeah, I'm going to stop here.
Very much, Professor Zhang. Just reading 3 papers by presenters today, including Professor Hu's presentation papers, feel like we just hear anti-Trump voices, anti-Trump campaign. So I feel like it applies to keep some balanced approach to as a moderator to American China relations. That means as you point and Mr. Professor Hu is pointing the same way is a controversial aspect of the Trump-China policy. Yeah, I admit that. We see that, and we fully agree to that point. But he did not. They do not point out controversial aspect of China's foreign policy and the behavior pattern in their diplomacy.
No, I'm not anti-Trump's China policy. I need to clarify.
Okay.
I'm
sure.
not criticizing
Right.
policy.
But
I know
just
from a realist
I'm
perspective,
just talking
his
about
China policy is
mood.
understandable.
Okay.
No, I don't have, I'm not criticizing foreign
Okay,
policy.
okay.
I only describe his policies.
All right.
Based on pure realist rationales, his
Yeah.
policies have sound strategic
Okay.
reasons. So I'm not criticizing
So
policy.
what I'm saying is China's strategic point, but which might not be acceptable by many the China neighboring countries. That is also the fact, the reality. And just reading the papers, just remind me of one saying: we need two to tango. If you just only one hand, you cannot. Just one person cannot dance the tango. So if any controversy is coming worse and worse, that means both sides do something, not just one side. The solution. That's the point. Of course, I'm not defending the Trump's or his policies. And then we have another presentation. Professor Wu Weixing is a professor of political science and head of the Department of the Politics and Public Administration at the University of Hong Kong, a very beautiful place in Hong Kong. Please, Professor Hu.
Thank you. First, I want to thank Jeju Peace Institute for inviting me here, and also Ambassador Lee's introduction. Now, following Ambassador Lee's instruction, we focus on the China-US rivalry and its impact on the region, and especially on the Korean Peninsula. So my presentation, only 10 minutes, I'll be very focused, to the point. Three things I want to say in this short presentation. First is about my general impression of Trump's foreign policy. And I'm not trying to defend somebody or trying to attack anybody, but as a IR scholar, I want to just make some of my own observation about U.S. foreign policy under Trump. Second, I want to talk about U.S.-China relations, and it is at crossroad and where it will go. And third is implication for the region. Now, first about Trump's foreign policy. We need to notice there are three very distinguished characteristics or features of Trump's foreign policy. First, as he stated repeatedly, American first foreign policy, which is he will focus very narrow national interest, trying to get job back to the U.S. and try to defend American interests abroad. So this has been happened over the last 2 years at expense of American soft power. So Trump, in many ways, is trying to tear up the post-war liberal international order. And so in many ways, as the two previous presenters already said, he's reverting American traditional foreign policy. Second, Trump is taking a very unilateralist approach to foreign policy. He has withdrawn from many important international treaty and agreement, including TPP, Paris Accord on Climate Change, UNESCO, the Human Rights Commission, and then recently INF. So this is at expense of U.S. foreign policy that Washington is losing friends and allies. So Trump basically asking the allies, you cannot free ride anymore on U.S. Defense policy. So you have to take up your own defense. And so in this ways, Trump is in many ways not engaging in regional policy as the previous administration. So these are the three distinguished features of Trump foreign policy. So this is very objective assessment of his policy. Now, turn to the second point, of how that policy will affect China-U.S. relations. Again, I will say three things. Now, the current bilateral relations is not in a very good shape. Everybody knows that. And the first years of Trump in office, 2017, actually the relationship was relatively smooth, very quiet, and Trump had a good visit. Actually, there's a good, there's an exchange of visit of two leaders. That's in Margala and also in Beijing was very, very successful. So Trump tried to get his house in order in the first year. So, and also he's in search of China policy. He didn't know much about how to run a big office. He didn't know how to approach China. So he made a good personal relations with President Xi. Now, this is the first year. Suddenly, in the beginning of 2018, we see a lot of changes. There are several reasons come in. First, he had a relatively stable foreign policy and national security team, and also his economic team in place. And then they began to get the feel about how to deal with China, especially focus on economic issues. And also, roughly in the same time, U.S. National Security Strategy report is published. In this report, everybody knows, China was labeled, or China was branded as strategic rival as U.S. So this, from then, the Trump's China policy or China strategy began to taking shape and becoming clearer. So there are three things. Now, the new focus is first is on trade war or trade friction with China. In the first year, Trump depended on Beijing or Xi Jinping's help to solve the North Korean nuclear issues. And so he shelved the trade issues. Now, the second year, he began to focus on the trade issues. So the trade friction started, and now we are in a stage, two sides are locked in in a stalemate about how to get out this trade war. Now, to resolve the trade war is not so difficult if you focus on very basic problem, which is the trade deficit. But trade deficit is more superficial, of more profound structural economic relations. If Beijing, or they make it very clear, if you focus on reducing the trade deficit, between China and the United States, will be easy. China will be easily increase its import from U.S. 200 billion every year, and then the gap will be narrower. But that's just the first round negotiation, and there was a deal reached, but Trump scrapped that deal. And then so this is the first level of the U.S.-China trade friction. The second level will be a little bit more difficult, which is focused on the investment and also industrial policy. when industrial policy get involved, it is, concern about economic sovereignty, and China will not easily to give in. So that will be more difficult, and also market access. But this is not something cannot be solved. I still can think market access can be solved. So the second level, there's still opportunity, two sides can reach the deal. So the first level is the trade deficit, which is count about 30% of the dispute. And another level, higher level, is the market access and investment, another 30–40% of the dispute. That can also be solved. But the third level, next level, will be much, much difficult, which is industrial policy. Industrial policy, which is another, big chunk of the dispute. And if you move the level, further elevate the fight, it will be geopolitical or geoeconomic struggling. That will be almost impossible to solve in the short terms. So now depends on the two leaders. They make up their mind where to draw the line. If you draw the line to solve the trade deficit issues, will be very easy. Next meeting between the two leaders at G20. The second level, difficult, but it's possible. It's not something impossible. And so I think the two teams are drafting deals, including redefine some rule of the games on the industrial policy level, and it's possible to get a deal in the G20 meetings, and it will be something, I would say, not something solve all the problem, but at least can put on the current dispute on hold. And to solve the most fundamental structural difficult, it's very, very difficult, and because it will easily elevate it to the geopolitical game. Now, so this is the current state of the U.S.-China relations at crossroad. Now, this is look like agenda-driven games, but if you look at behind this agenda-driven dynamics between U.S. and China, actually you will find something more profound. U.S.-China relation began to change, not start with Trump administration, actually start with Obama, from the second term of Obama, especially if you want to trace further back in the December of 2011, start with Copenhagen summit meeting, because it's a failed attempt to reach agreement between Obama administration and Beijing. So start from there, the relationship began to deteriorate. And then that point triggered a wide debate in U.S. policy community. They call it China debate. China debate is about what's going wrong with our China policy. So U.S. have, in history, have many times debate about China policies. That's one of the most recent one. And then that China debate actually is already have some consensus among elite about what went wrong with China policy. And most people think the current China policy, based on the engagement, cannot last forever. Actually, the assumption all got wrong, because we assume if we use engagement to open up China, China will becoming more and more liberal. But it's not the case. It is actually the opposite. So they try to rethink, reflect what went wrong about China policy. So this is the more fundamental underlying dynamics between the two countries, between on the U.S.-China policies. So if this thing's going further, so no matter which party in the office, take in the overall office, the U.S.-China relations were not getting better, if not turning worse. So this is the bigger background about U.S.-China policy. So that's why in my paper was a little bit pessimistic if we look at down the road. So if the two leaders can find a way to manage the current friction, will be good news. If they cannot manage, now I'm getting very pessimistic. So given the time, I will switch to the third things I want to say about implication for the region. First, for the region, we're talking about East Asian region. There are opportunities arise for the regional corporations. So there's a lot of regional dialogue platform, ARF, APEC, TPP, or CPTPP, or RCEP. Now, all these regional dialogue platform facing new opportunities. If we can grasp this opportunity, we'll see a new round of regional cooperation, because U.S. and under Trump is relatively detached from these regional dynamics. So we'll see, I did a lot of work about regional cooperation in the early 21st century, after Asian financial crisis. So I remember clearly after Asian financial crisis, we have a new wave of regional cooperation, actually proposed by President Kim Dae-jung, the East Asian Study Group and the East Asian Vision Group. This new wave actually stopped when the big power returned to regional politics. Now we see the new opportunity. If we can grasp this opportunity, we'll see some new progress on that. So I just threw out the question first. We can discuss this later. The second implication is on the Korean Peninsula. Now we are at a critical moment how to push forward denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Now all the major players have their own agenda. For ROK, the agenda is North-South process, how to push this North-South dialogue and the momentum or rapprochement further. And then the second thing is ROK is trying to, on the driver's seat, to facilitate U.S.-North Korean dialogue on nuclear denuclearization things. I think ROK did very well, and everybody know that, and we pretty much appreciate this effort. Now for China, there are three processes in parallel. First is, of course, China very interested in the denuclearization process. Second is how we can put in place a peace regime in this region, what we call Northeast Asian peace process. The third process, of course, because the new development, it opened up China's relation with North Korea. So there's a bilateral process between Pyongyang and Beijing on how to help North Korea to redevelop or try to refocus on economic development and then get it opened up and then reform process started as China did 40 years ago. Now for US, the priority after the midterm election, I think in my observation began to change. Trump administration may not so hurry, not in a rush to push the dialogue, the denuclearization dialogue with North Korea. So they may slow down because Trump will figure that he needs the North Korean breakthrough more for the 2020 presidential re-election, not now. And he wants to harvest that later, not now. So that is put on hold, not as a priority. Now, the Trump's North Korean policy probably also have to consider the changing political environment in U.S. congressional elections. Although Republicans still control the Senate, but he's lost the control of the House. And then so he's facing the tough battles in the future if the House controlled by the Democrats start impeachment process or other process. So there's a political agenda that's began to change. So I just threw out this question. We can discuss that because my time is up. So I will stop here, and then we can further discuss during the Q&A time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hu. Actually, you, Professor Zhang and Professor Hu, you made some suggestion in your paper how that impact on Korean Peninsula and how the South Korea deal with that kind of the influence by coming from the confrontation. But you didn't, in your presentation, that part is omitted. Maybe you're more focused on other things. So maybe we will be appreciated. I want to hear your view on what is the kind of the solution, or Korea should take a stance in the years to come. That is, both of you suggest maybe Korea-ASEAN horizontal coordination in that part, but can you elaborate on that? But how, and actually how we can have with regard to denuclearization of North Korea, how South Korea can work with the ASEAN in what area we can joint work to make a success and progress in the denuclearization of North Korea. It will be appreciated if you have chance to touch on that part. Then we have now 3 panelists. I'm sorry, we have a little bit behind the schedule, so I'll give the 5 minutes to each of you. First, Professor John Delury. Am I wrong pronunciation?
No, it's close. Delury.
Delury, yeah. Is a
Not
professor.
Delury.
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 Chinese studies at the Yonsei University. Please, Professor.
Thank you, Ambassador. So I'll just jump right in. These are very interesting papers and presentations. I think the central topic here that's very important for South Korea, because I don't hear a lot of this conference actually. I think there needs to be more attention paid to this U.S.-China rivalry and the so-called new consensus. So that's really the center point, I think, of the 3 presentations. So a couple questions as we continue to discuss this that I'm thinking through, and these papers help me continue to think through, are this new consensus. How new is it? How valid is it? How strong is it? And how far will it go? I think a lot of the content relates to wrestling with those questions. And so a couple things I would highlight. In terms of how new, strategic competition, that phrase is not new. In fact, I stumbled on thinking about this and digging around a little bit. There's a Richard Baum article on U.S.-China relations, from strategic partners to strategic competitors, ? Published in August 2001. So the strategic competition paradigm or concept has been there for quite a while, and the presentations pointed out the roots of that in the Obama years as well. The phrase that actually strikes me as this is where there's a new dynamic is another common phrase now, peer rival or peer competitor, because peer is not a normal part of U.S.-China relations. Seeing China as a peer or coming close to a peer level, that's quite different. That's quite different from the Cold War context and even the post-Cold War context. But still, I think we need to really think through that question about how new is it, and the panel has helped us consider that a little bit. How valid, this is one place I'd probably push back a little bit against maybe all 3 of the papers, because the focus seemed to be on indigenous causes of it, that are a result of Trump or connected with U.S. Domestic issues, economic issues. Professor Zhang on a declining power. I don't disagree that there are numerous factors that are sort of internal to the United States in a way. I would add the end of basically the global war on terror, and one of you mentioned this, the victory over ISIS, or perceived victory over ISIS and Al-Qaeda, means the national security establishment needs an enemy. I mean, they have to justify these budgets, and so China and Russia leapt to the front, and I certainly see that logic in terms of the national security strategy and national defense strategy. But where I saw a lot less was, there are exogenous factors here. There are things that Americans see happening in China. They've been seeing them for a while, and they've seen the negative trends intensify under Xi Jinping. And so it's not just about Trump and U.S. domestic and kind of identity crisis and these kinds of things. There are real reasons out there, and just to list a couple of them, the IP issue, which is so common in any among the business community. Made in China 2025, yeah, it's about nationalism and the national competition, but it's also a perceived statement of we're just going to plunge straight ahead with stealing all your technology, and we, have absolutely no apology for it. In fact, we're going to make it all ours within a few years. The general lack of the perceived lack of Xi Jinping really continuing with Deng's program of economic reform and opening up. That's a fairly common view, that Xi is not really an economic reformer, and that he's pulled back from that, which is disappointing, to the American view of China. And just generally that, Xi is seen as much more authoritarian of a leader. There's a kind of rise of personal authoritarianism. He's closer to Putin, less flamboyant, but I don't think any of the papers mentioned something that is getting a lot of attention in the United States right now. I see very little attention in South Korea, but for those who follow China in the United States, a lot of the discussion is about Xinjiang and re-education camps opening on the scale of hundreds of thousands of people. And then of course you've got South China Sea's militarization kind of moving forward. So these are just ticking off a list of these are actions that have been around for a while, but in the American view, and this is where you get this bipartisan consensus. These are things that Democrats care about and Republicans care about. These are things that liberals care about and conservatives care about. And these are actions taken closely associated with Xi Jinping that have, I think we need, in terms of how valid is this consensus, I would intervene to say, there are reasons that Americans see it as rooted in the behavior of China, not just in their own internal problems. How strong is it? We've talked about, who's behind this consensus. Again, I agree with the view of the panels that it's got a strong basis across the elites and the establishment. It's less clear how the American public feels about it. And, another question, I'm not so clear about where Trump really falls on this. I think that Trump, actually it sort of parallels his approach with North Korea. Trump moves back and forth between buying this consensus and then rejecting it. Well, we all have strong views about Trump. But in my assessment, Trump could not surprise us by suddenly saying in Buenos Aires, oh, Xi and I made a deal, I worked this thing out, and suddenly this big consensus, this Pence consensus, the people behind that will say, what is he doing? That's not, that was not in the script. Just like he went off script in Singapore and kind of goes off script with the North Korea issue. So I'm not quite sure where in the end Trump will fall. And then how far the papers lay out, they're very dark, they're very pessimistic papers. It's worth translating them into Korean and circulating them widely. Because again, this is not reflective of a Hong Kong view or a Singapore view. This is what I hear also all the time, is that there's a real strong sense U.S.-China relations have moved in this very new space, and it's kind of a question of how bad a Cold War. Professor Resnick even talks about cataclysmic war, actual military conflict. So real quickly now, in terms of response, that's the other. It's really secondary, but it's our main topic in a way here, is to think through the implications of this U.S.-China rivalry for South Korea, specifically ROK-ASEAN relations. And actually I was thinking of a dinner conversation with Ambassador Chung. We were talking about Grecian topics, as he's former ambassador to Greece. And everyone knows about the Thucydides trap, which is the standard paradigm right now for U.S.-China relations. There's, of course, other traps in Thucydides. There's the Melian trap, which is what does the small power do when forced with this choice? As the panelists are describing, the fear in the region should be, if this continues and intensifies, everyone's going to have to choose. Who are you with? And it's framed as pressure from the U.S., but of course it will be pressure from China as well, if these very dark forecasts are correct. So that's just another way to kind of frame the gravity of the problem. And if the problem is as grave as many in the panel are anticipating, then I'd kind of like to hear a little bit stronger and bolder thinking about, how far can you think? I mean, Professor Zhang, for example, and Professor Resnick already has some of that there. But in terms of security, Professor Zhang calls it horizontal coordination. If this really gets bad between the U.S. and China, then South Korea and ASEAN and others, Japan for that matter, are all going to have serious interests in moving a lot more quickly towards security cooperation of a level that is also unprecedented. If you're faced with an unprecedented change in the great power relationship in the region, then the small powers and middle powers will have to consider unprecedented moves. So a format like this where academics, no one's listening to us, we can think ahead and think beyond. So I'd like to push the thinking here to hear your thoughts beyond, RCEP and TPP. How far can you imagine this going in terms of horizontal coordination? I better stop there in interest of time, but thank you, very interesting papers.
Professor Somai Kobayashi. Professor Kobayashi and professor at the College of Law, Nihon University in Tokyo. Please.
Just 5 minutes, right? Yeah. Okay. So in order to save the time, so I'd like to skip the second paragraph. So just asking 3 questions here. So the first, I have the 3 questions. The first query pertains to the U.S. policy concerning China. What triggered the transformation of the U.S. policy toward China or affected Trump's views on China? If the policy has not changed, why did the Trump administration unveil its stance toward China as rival or enemy state? Second question, yeah. To all the panelists. Yeah, the second question relates to Beijing's understanding of the U.S. policy on China. I am concerned about the miscommunication and the misconstruction that can be observed between Washington and Beijing because, historically, such misapprehensions cause wars and terrible miseries. The Japanese people experienced such conflict in the Pacific War against the U.S. in 1941. In my opinion, Beijing does not understand the seriousness of the Trump administration's stance toward China and the mood in Washington, D.C. In other words, Beijing may conjecture the Trump administration will finally compromise with China's administration. I seek your evaluations of Beijing's recognition of Washington's intention. My third question concerns the difficult issue which both Korea and Japan has been tackling in recent years. Since last spring, Tokyo has been making great efforts to improve its relations with Beijing, and subsequently, Abe visited China at the end of October. Japanese government and the Chinese government are planning the visit of Xi Jinping visit to Tokyo next spring. He will come to Tokyo. Yeah, surely. And Japan's administration declared China as a strategic partner and not a rival state. Tokyo and Beijing intend to develop their relations primarily at the economic level. Moreover, Tokyo has indicated its cooperation with the Belt and Road Initiative with some restrictions. However, this relation is just one bet, 2 dreams. So, because Japanese government wants to restore the situation between China and Japan in 2008, but Chinese governments want to maintain the status quo at the present. 2008 for Japanese government is very important year because Japanese government agreed with the Chinese government about the cooperation, economic cooperation, development being a cooperation about the natural resources, natural gas near the Senkaku Island. So it is very important. But Chinese government does not consider does not understand. I'm not sure. So does not understand the Japanese government's intent. And the so actually, so we can find the recognition gap between China and Japan. There are differences. The recognition gap will be appeared in after 2021 because Abe's administration will be finished in 2021, surely. So Abe understands that. So yeah, and also the yeah. On the other hand, Tokyo has also projected its support for free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, and has opened a cooperative channel with the U.S., UK, Australia, India, and other nations. Vice President Mike Pence visited Tokyo today, and then going to the Singapore, and so then he will make a statement on the FOIP. And so the Beijing regards FOIP as a security alliance that targets China and Russia. In addition, Washington is scrutinizing Tokyo's relations with China as Japan seeks to resolve the difficult issue of developing the U.S.-Japan alliance while cooperating with China at the economic level. Seoul is attempting to solve a similar problem pertaining to the Korea-U.S. alliance and its economic and political ties with China. Unfortunately, also Tokyo and Seoul share such comparable tasks regarding regional bilateral cooperation. Japan-Korea relations continue to be politically unstable. In my, of course, Korea, in my opinion, working together on the analogous programs is the key for improvement of Japan-Korea relations. I would like your suggestion for overcoming the dilemma that Korea and Japan has encountered in the recent tensions between U.S. and China. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kobayashi. Just in person, I want to ask you later maybe, what is the, you said one belt, two dreams. What is Japan's dreams? You don't have to tell me now, but at lunchtime you tell me just what is Japan's. I know it's China's dream, but I don't know it's Japanese dream. Then we have the last panelist, Dr. Yi Sung-woo. He is a research fellow of the Jeju Peace Institute. Please.
Thank you.
Dr. Lee.
I'm going to speak in English. You guys might need a simultaneous machine. Yeah. 먼저 미국의 군사 전략에 대해서 말씀드리겠습니다. 미국은 전통적인 군사 전략은 offset strategy입니다. 기술적으로 압도적인 우위를 유지함으로써 추격국가, 경쟁국가가 군사적으로 미국에 대적할 수 없는 압도적인 힘의 우위를 유지하는 것이 전통적인 군사 전략인데, 지금 나타나고 있는 게 레이저건이나 레일포, 레일 캐논 또는 클라이밋 웨폰 같은 것들이 그 중요한 예에 해당되고, 이러한 전통은 트럼프 행정부로 바뀌었다고 해서 큰 변화가 없습니다. 그리고 트럼프 대통령이 후보자 시절과 임기 초기에 고립주의를 택하는 듯 했으나 지금에 와서는 군사적으로 과거에 부시 행정부가 추진했던 니오콘에 더 가까운 쪽으로 돌아섰습니다. 그 가장 대표적인 사례가 주한미군 철수 문제라든가 한국이 핵을 가지든 말든 그것은 그들이 알아서 할 문제라고 했던 그런 고립주의에서 적극적인 역할로 돌아섰다는 것이 바로 트럼프의 군사정책이 전환됐다는 걸 의미하고 있고, 여기서 중국에 대한 강경 정책을 유지하고 있습니다. 동남아시아에서도 중국이 남중국해에서 군사적으로 확장 일로에 있는 부분에 대해서 미국은 중국에 대해서 항행의 자유 등을 통해서 중국의 현상 유지를 인정하지 않으려는 쪽으로 나가고 있고, 그다음에 중국은 동남아시아에서 동맹을 확장하고자 하고 있지만 미국이 여기에 대한 강력한 경은제를 하고 있고, 필리핀과 상당한 동남아 국가들, 그다음에 베트남은 미국과의 더 가까운 쪽으로 군사적인 태세를 전환하고 있습니다. 그리고 중국의 1대1로가 경제적 인센티브를 통해서 동남아의 동맹국을 확보하려고 했지만 지금 현재 빠져나가고 있습니다. 동남아 참여 국가들이. 그다음 경제적으로는 트럼프 행정부는 과거와 달리 다자주의에서 미국의 직접적인 이익이 되지 않는 국제무역 관행은 다자주의든 도덕적 명분에 의해서 수용하지 않겠다는 입장입니다. 그래서 나프타를 개정했고 TPP에서 빠져나왔고 파리 기후협약에서도 탈퇴했습니다. 오늘도 마크롱 프랑스 대통령과 메르켈 독일 총리, 그리고 구테러스 사무총장 등은 유엔 사무총장 등은 민족주의의 위험성을 경고하면서 트럼프에 대한 공세와 비난을 하고 있지만, 그렇다고 이것이 시진핑에 대한 지지는 아닙니다. 그들의 유럽 국가들의 입장은 트럼프가 중국의 잘못을 바로잡는 방식에는 동의하지 않지만 중국의 잘못된 행태에 대한 문제 제기는 인정한다라는 입장을 여전히 유지하고 있고요. 그다음에 국제사회는 미국에게 과거와 같이 비네볼런트한 헤지몬, 즉 자비로운 이 헤게모니 국가가 되기를 원합니다. 그래서 과거처럼 레짐을 유지하는 비용이라든가 안보 비용, 그다음에 거래 비용 등을 계속 맡아주는 관대한 헤지몬을 원하고 있지만, 미국은 이제 그것을 하지 않겠다는 것이 트럼프의 입장인 것 같습니다. 그리고 이러한 힘에 있어서도 오바마 정부에서는 소프트 파워 정진을 통한 우회로를 통해서 헤지모닉 스테이트를 유지하자고 했지만, 트럼프 행정부는 보다 더 직설적인 방법으로 미국의 하드 파워를 정진시키는 방법을 모색하고 있습니다. 그래서 이번 미국 선거를 보자면 트럼프는 미국 선거에 있어서 하원을 잃었지만 대체적인 여론의 평가는 성공적인 선방을 했다. 과거 중간 선거에서 대통령들이 거둔 것에 비하면. 그리고 세컨드 텀 일렉션에 있어서도 유리한 고지를 점령했다라고 이야기하는 것이 여러분 그 파티 리얼라이먼트, 미국 유권자들의 재구성에 있어서 소위 말하는 러스트 벨트, 팜 벨트, 그리고 남부의 바이블 벨트를 다 통합해 보면 미국의 국토 전체를 전반으로 잘라서 동쪽 전체가 미국의 트럼프 대통령을 지지하는 형상을 보이고 있기 때문에 도리어 재선에는 파란불이 들어왔다라고 보고 있는 것 같습니다. 그래서 미국의 유권자 수준에서 볼 필요가 있습니다. 과거 트럼프 대통령은 선거 구호가 Make America Great Again을 외쳤습니다. 그때 힐러리 후보는 미국은 이미 위대하다라는 말을 했지만 유권자들은 원치 않았습니다. 이게 결국은 러시아의 푸틴 대통령도 대통령 선거전에서 강력한 러시아, 즉 핵추진 미사일이라든가, 시진핑도 자기의 임기 연장을 위해서 자기 당의 헌장을 바꾸는 데 있어서도 중국몽과 같은 강력한 중국이라는 구호 정치가 워킹했습니다. 미국의 유권자들도 강력한 미국을 재건함으로써 슈퍼파워를 유지해야 된다는 데 대해서 미국의 일반적인 유권자들이 동의하고 있다는 증거가 아닐까 봅니다. 그래서 이 문제는 트럼프를 아웃라이어로 생각하는 주류의 언론과 여론 주도 집단들이 이 시각을 어떻게 수정하느냐의 시간과의 싸움이라고 봅니다. 어떤 일이냐면은 트럼프 정책이 지금 중간선거 이후로 미국의 이익을 지속적으로 확보해 나가면서 지금 현재까지 유지되고 있는 경제 상황, 완전 고용에 가까운 실업 상황이라든가, 그다음에 물가를 잘 잡아주고 나머지 2년을 유지한다면 트럼프는 이 외교 정책에 있어서도 현재와 같은 조금 누가 보기에는 막말 정치라고 하는 그러한 과격한 정치가 유권자들에게 도리어 힘을 얻지 않을까 생각합니다. 그래서 이러한 미국 국내 정치의 상황을 한반도 문제에 그대로 적용해 보자면 북한은 비핵화 의지가 어느 정도 있다고 봅니다. 그러나 한반도 비핵화는 미국과 북한의 서로 신뢰의 문제입니다. 서로 비핵화가 완전히 되면 제재를 풀어주겠다는 것이고, 북한 쪽에서는 단계적으로 우리가 비핵화를 진전시킴에 따라서 제재를 단계적으로 해소해달라는 것인데, 미국의 양보가 되고 안 되고의 문제는 앞에서 말했듯이 트럼프 대통령이 미국의 국내적인 여론과 주류 언론으로부터 북한에 대한 단계적인 이 제재 완화가 어느 정도 가능한 자율성을 누리느냐의 문제인데, 이게 순응할 수 있는 가능성은 바로 이 국내 정치적으로 트럼프가 효과적인 대책을 세워나가는 것입니다. 그리고 트럼프 개인적으로도 지금 여전히 국내 정치적인 위기에 있기 때문에 한반도 비핵화와 같은 역사적인 업적을 남기고자 하는 개인적인 어떤 그런 동기, 모티베이션이 이 한반도 문제 비핵화를 해결하는 데 있어서는 가장 큰 쟁점이 될 것이고, 여기에 미국이 중국에게 요구하는 역할은 특별하게 북한을 어떻게 비핵화를 끌어들이려는 역할보다는 북한에 대한 생션을 계속 유지하라는 쪽에서 멈춰져 있던 것 같습니다. 어제 이루어진 2+2 협상 연례로 하는 회의에서도 중국이 미국에 대해서 북한에 대한 생션을 유지하기로 합의해 준 것은 바로 트럼프 대통령이 이제까지 자신이 유지해왔던 한반도 비핵화 정책에 대해서 정책의 지속성을 유지할 수 있는 그러한 단초가 아닐까 이렇게 생각합니다. 감사합니다.
I give a microphone to all the panelists and the presenters. I want to open to the floor. Maybe we have the 10 minutes to go. So maybe 2 or 3.
Can we prolong the panel meeting by 15 minutes?
Prolong. You see, Dr. Key, he want to have the 15 minutes more? He said no. Maybe lunch the place. So we can have some lunch. We can more talks at the lunch. You want to say something on that occasion at the lunch? Before the lunch, we can eating and you can hear your view on that point. Okay, so let's say have 10 minutes to spend for open to the floor, and then we have the responses from presenters and the panelists. So maybe we can have 2 or 3 comment or questions from the floor. Okay.
Prime Minister Abe paid an official visit to China. I heard that there was some discussion on Japan's possible joining the landmark project of President Xi Jinping in the form of Belt and Road Initiative. I'm just wondering, to what extent is Japan ready to cooperate with China on the implementation of such a project? Okay, thank you.
Another comment? Okay, Dr. Lee.
My name is Chae-Hyun Lee from ASEAN Institute. Thank you for the presentations and the discussions. I have a couple of comments on the presentation. I'm not an expert on the U.S. and China relations, but I get some ideas from my friends who are looking at the China-U.S. relations. And as Professor John Delury said, that the U.S. and China relation in the past has been always it's defined by competition, but despite that long competition, over the time, the instrument and tool the two countries have adopted have been changing, and this is just my hunch and my friend's hunch, but this time on the Trump administration, I mean, the Cold War against the US, against the Soviet was a kind of war of a position. Now what Trump is pursuing is a kind of a war of a maneuver. So focus all your fire on China for a couple of years and make China knee down. That I believe that is kind of strategy that the U.S. government is adopting at the moment. And the previous governments, for example, the governments before Obama, they were looking at the military side or other issues, and Obama administration was trying to get the China into the institution to fix its behavior in regional institution, but it failed. And what Trump administration is doing is that kind of the Chinese military power and other powers, they are fundamentally based on economic power, Chinese economic power. So focus on Chinese economic power. If you can undermine the Chinese economic power, then you can solve all other issues like China's military threat or whatever. So I guess that is kind of the Trump administration's strategy toward China at the moment. And that just forget about the allies, regional allies, and other countries in the region. If you bear the pain for a couple of years, then we can fix China. And the other point I would like to make is the kind of a comparison between the U.S.-China strategy and the U.S.-North Korea strategy. And the couple of days ago, Trump made a good comments on his relation with President Xi Jinping. And it was quite interesting. If you look at what Trump has done toward North Korea, it was all about threatening for a year, and then in 2018 he changed his position toward North Korea and making good comments and meeting Kim Jong-un, and he mentioned something about love affair with the Chairman Kim Jong-un, and comments like beautiful letters and all that. So in 2018 it was all like the U.S.-North Korea relation, and 2017 when it comes to U.S.-China relations. And now the trade war and this difficult relation between the U.S. and China has been on for a year, and now is the time for U.S. to come out to talk with China. If you surrender, then I will stop here. And I guess that strategy is pretty much the same towards North Korea. And 1 year threatening and bit of reconciliatory posture towards North Korea. And if North Korea surrenders, then I will accept your surrender. Otherwise, I will continue this economic sanction. That is typical U.S. strategy, Trump's strategy, I guess.
We have stopped here. No more questions from the floor, because we have now, I'll give it to each the presenters and the panelists 2 minutes. 2 minutes, and for panelists just 1 minute to respond the questions raised from the floor and from panelists.
Okay, yeah, very quickly. There were a series of great questions that have been asked by several people, but I just wanted to touch on a couple of themes. One is the U.S. public, which is a very important element in the Sino-U.S. competition to the extent it exists, or Sino-U.S. Cold War to the extent it exists. And the public is highly inattentive in the United States to foreign policy generally right now, but I would say especially to the U.S.-China rivalry. I think this is still largely taking place at the level of policy and intellectual elites and hasn't really filtered down very much to the U.S. body politic. The top issues that have been vexing the U.S. politic in the run-up to the U.S. midterm elections of last week were all domestic, particularly healthcare. Small and medium state responses to this competition. Well, we all know that the majority of the countries in the region, especially in Southeast Asia, have been hedging between the two. They don't want to make a decision one way or the other for very good reason. But as the competition intensifies between the two sort of big giants of the region, how viable will such continued hedging be? And how much latitude will Beijing and Washington provide these states in terms of being able to avoid making a firm commitment to one or the other? And as far as this competition, I think that given that China and the U.S. are nuclear armed, powers, and the likelihood of a big land war in Asia is extremely unlikely. Much of the competition will be economic and geopolitical, trying to attract allies and friends in East Asia, or Indo-Pacific, whatever you want to call it, the region. And as far as that competition is concerned, the U.S. and China they both have some very strong advantages and disadvantages. The U.S. is far away, which makes it less threatening and more appealing for most of the small and medium powers in the region. But at the same time, the great distance also makes the U.S. inattentive to the region, also makes the U.S. seem capricious and easily distracted. On the other side of the coin, China is much closer, which makes China more interested in what's going on day to day. And China has a much higher resolve in settling these various regional disputes than the U.S. does. But on the other hand, China's close proximity to the small and medium powers of the region also makes it much more threatening to them and to their survival than the United States, which ironically is much more powerful militarily, but is several thousand miles away for the most part. The U.S. also has considerably more soft power that sort of emanates from its domestic political system, its liberal vision for international order. Right, we see the rules-based order is a very important concept. Especially where I am in Southeast Asia, that's sort of a recurrent trope, which suggests that the U.S. still has lots of has considerable amount of tools in its arsenal in this sort of sustained competition. China seems to lack a sort of broad vision, although it's trying to make some strides in this area. China has a much greater advantage in economic statecraft. The BRI is like Marshall Plan on steroids. So. The U.S. simply cannot mobilize that sort of money that sort of largesse to throw at the region to attract sympathy and support. So it's going to be an interesting competition, but it seems to me that the pressure is going to slowly intensify on all the small and medium powers to take a more pronounced commitment one way or the other. I'd be surprised if that was not the case.
Okay, thank you. Just 2 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you. First, I want to address the denuclearization issue. I thought about talking about that, and then I forgot because yesterday Ambassador Lee asked me to briefly examine that, and Dr. Yi mentioned the issue too. I think the Cold War scenario is not good for North Korea's denuclearization. No. Kim was partly agreed to at least rhetorically commit to denuclearization because China supported the United States sanctions. Their cooperation led to unprecedented level of UN sanctions on North Korea, and which really made North Koreans' life difficult. But now, because of the new Cold War, China would have no longer have any incentives to punch North Korea. Instead, their bilateral relationships have dramatically improved. You say China still supports sanctions, yes, but doesn't mean anything, because China outside the sanction framework, they have already massively increased economic aid to North Korea. So it is now far more likely that North Korea will survive economically without denuclearization. And therefore the prospect is getting dimmer and dimmer, precisely because of the new Cold War, okay? China would be stupid to support further sanctions if say Kim refuses to denuclearize after 2 years. United States, if Trump's reelected, asked China to do more, China would be stupid to support him. North Korea is a strategic tool for China, to keep the United States distracted. So the prospect, because of the Cold War, prospect of denuclearization of North Korea actually getting dimmer. Then I think John asked a couple of very good questions. How new is this? The U.S. policy with China since Clinton era always had containment element, competition element, but they also have cooperation element and even limited accommodation. George Bush, I think, probably is the most generous in that sense, and that's why he was missed dearly by the Chinese when he left the office. He was the only country that missed him, the Chinese, because he proposed responsible stakeholder theory. We enlarge China's role in international arena. Let China share leadership so they would become a stakeholder. They will be more loyal to the system. Chinese love that, but today's posture is a pure competition, pure containment. And that relates to your other question, how valid it is. Actually, from a strategic perspective, That's why I clarified when you commented. I don't criticize Trump's foreign policy, China policy. It has a strong strategic logic. The strategic logic is you now need to do everything you can to stop China's further increase in power, capabilities, influence. Otherwise, U.S. leadership position will be eroded. It will be gone. And so from the pure strategic realist perspective, Trump's containment policy is utterly rational. Utterly rational. There's nothing wrong with it. Similarly placed leaders would have done the same. If position reversed, China would have done the same. Because otherwise it would be too late. China will catch up, and no dominant state wants to be eclipsed by rising power. It's not in the strategic interest to be eclipsed. You are always better off if you have more power than the next country. So therefore, I think in that sense, it's actually valid. The policy, containment policy, if there is one, is actually valid. It has its strategic drawbacks, costs, but maybe, as some people logically think, the costs outweigh, the gains outweigh the costs. But on the other hand, you mentioned China's behaviors that may have contributed to this, right? Rather than the U.S. strategic motives. I think they are not really that valid. I think you said IP theft. Who are the victims? People have pointed it out. No U.S. big companies or even medium-sized companies have come out to say, I was coerced to share my technologies for market access. Right? Where are the victims? Who are the victims? We haven't seen a single one. Yeah.
Maybe one comment to what is then raised. You're not going to touch on that part. He raised the 3 point. Okay.
Say Xi is conservative, repressive, but Mao and Deng even more repressive. They were good friends in the United States. So it's not that important maybe. Reform stalled under who and when. Guojin Mintui happened in Hu administration. It's no problem, It's really the strategic logic, I think. But the United States need to mobilize ideological issues to legitimize the shift towards containment policy. That part, maybe that's the only reason.
Okay, 2 minutes, right? 2 minutes. Difficult to answer the question in 2 minutes. But I focus on 2 questions. First, John DeRoe's questions about the U.S.-China strategic rivalry. You asked very good questions. How new it is, how valid, how strong it is, and how far it will go. I think these are all excellent questions. But this is the question about degree of something, right? So it's very difficult to answer the degree of something. And then secondly, my answer is on whose part? On part of U.S. or on part of China? You're asking this perception or the what is the policy, the real policy? If on the U.S. side, I pretty much agree with your observation. On the Chinese side, may be a little bit different, because they approach these issues from different angle. Another thing I would say, does this really matters? You ask this question for Trump administration. Yes, it is matters to some degrees, but Trump can change it overnight because his policy with high degree of uncertainties. We don't know what's his next move, and he can change a policy very quickly, and so that's the difficult part to answer your question. Now, secondly, move to the another question about Trump policy and the Korean denuclearization issues. I think Trump's policy and the U.S.-China relations create a big have some profound impact on the future process of Korean Peninsula denuclearization process. Few things. First, it is the international united front on North Korean denuclearization issues has pretty much disappeared, or the focus of international united front has blurred or getting very, the focus is not, it's began to gone. It's no longer everybody agreed priority number one is denuclearization. We should have maximized pressure on North Korea to give up nuclear weapons first, and then we do other things. This consensus pretty much disappeared. So the priority and policy preference for different players began to change. So ROK, China, US, Japan, and other players, they probably are not on the same page on this maximize pressure and the policy priority. Now, these lead to the second questions. The future Korean Peninsula denuclearization process, who's going to be the leader? Who's going to be the driver? What's the main driving force for this? As I discussed very briefly, there are different processes or different preference, and countries have different priorities. So it's difficult to say US will lead this process or the only leader to pushing forward. So China have its own agenda, and ROK have its own agenda. Different process will going on. Although US and North Korean deal is still the most important part of the whole overall bargain to solve this denuclearization process. But regardless of US and the North Korean process, there are other processes going on, and then that may affect the main game. Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah, real fast, don't worry, 60 seconds. Okay, so amplify 2 points, Professor Hu and Professor Zhang. Your insight about Trump and how his unpredictability, that is central. We all see that at the time. There is, I think, a logic to it in terms of his character as a leader. It's as a businessman, not as a statesman. So when you say what's the policy, his policy is consistent, it's stable, it changes more slowly based on a process and a consensus. Trump has no interest in policy. It's about deal making, and so that's a lot of what happened with North Korea was setting up this great deal, doing the deal, talking about how great the deal was, regardless of the actual content of the deal, which is what drives people crazy. And so I agree, I said that could happen with China. He could say, oh, I made a great deal, and the policy community is all gonna, I won't use the expression in English. To Bao Hui, I would amplify your point. You always frame it in realist terms, but of course you have to bear in mind realism is not the dominant paradigm in the United States. What's so interesting is the typical American foreign policy person who considers themselves a liberal, they are making that same argument, but on liberal terms, right? Because they feel we have to act now while the power differential is still clear, we're still hegemonic. We have to act now, not on a realist logic, but on a liberal logic. We have to save the system, before the Chinese have more power than we do. So the realist logic and a liberal logic are converging, and again, that's part of the consensus. And then really, really quickly, the last thing, just as a historian, we're talking so much about Cold War, it makes me nervous. I mean, we all know this, but there are these fundamental differences. It's so anachronistic to use this metaphor. And we know those anachronisms about how the US and the Soviets didn't have a significant economic relationship, how there was a very clear and to all the actors, meaningful ideological competition between the Soviets and the US that doesn't apply in the US-China case. So I just want to caution. Again, it's kind of like analytically we're fighting the last battle. There's frankly a little bit of laziness on our part where we all say Cold War, Cold War, Cold War. We need to see this thing in its own terms. It's not going to be a repetition of the Cold War, so I would push back against overusing that analogy a bit.
제가 한국어로 말씀드리겠습니다. 1대1로에 대해서는 그 일본 정부로서는 적극적으로 참가를 검토한다. 그런 얘기밖에 얘기 안 씁니다. 그러니까 잠가한다라고 하는 말이 한 번도 쓴 적이 없고요. 그러니까 지난 중일 회담에서도 1대1로에 관한 얘기는 안 나왔습니다. 일본 정부는 적극적으로 잠가를 검토하는데 그거에 대해서는 조건이 있습니다. 몇 가지 조건이 있습니다. 첫 번째는 금융 투명성, 그 다음에 재정 건전성, 그 다음에 법에 의한 지배. 그거를 해결되지 못하면 일본 정부로서는 1대1로 참석 안 한다. 그런 입장이 공식적인 입장이라고 들었습니다. 이상입니다.
I have a lot of opinion on everybody's opinion, but I'm not going to spend time on that. But I partly agree with you, but in terms of the Cold War type of issues, but there is some similarity also existed there. Two power competing in military area, and once they notice that military supremacy can support their economic interest, that's why President Trump and Xi Jinping competing in South China Sea. That's a part of the competition features in these matters. And I forgot the other issues, but we can talk in lunch session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's my fault already 10 minutes behind the schedule, but I have to say one minute. Can I use just 1 minute to finalize? I also have the many questions and comments to make, but just only delete all part. Just one thing. We hear a lot from the American perspective and the Chinese perspective, but I have to say this from Koreans. We have to, and small and medium countries in this region, also they have they want to raise their voices, but that part is also taken into consideration in China-American relations. Recently, just I take one thing. Mahathir, Prime Minister Mahathir of Malaysia, he was in power 23 years by way of 15 years, and now he take the power again as a Prime Minister of Malaysia in a very fair election in Malaysia. In his visit to China, and in his joint press media with Li Keqiang, he said, Li Keqiang said we have the very free trade between the China and Malaysia. But Li Keqiang and the Mahathir said, what we need more is fair trade. And his comment was followed by one thing, surprised to me. We have to, that is new set of the colonialism is in this region. That's indirectly, maybe some big powers try to bring in the colonialism in this new type of colonialism in this region. So that's one thing. And many trade relations dispute, trade war between two countries. But what I have to say as a Korean is, as just hear from the Korean small and medium companies, they bring their new product in Chinese market, but in a couple of months, this copy is there in Chinese market, so they just give up its business in China. That means there is the international standard and the Chinese standard. There is some big, sometimes China stands higher than the international standard. That's true, but many cases, China standard, international standards much higher than Chinese standard. If you try to stay on China's standard with the excuse that we have now trade war with America, so we have to stay on. That is damaging to all countries, neighboring countries in this region. So no matter what the Americans saying, China try to reform, continue to reform, trade gap, the narrow the gap between the Chinese standard and international standard. This could be IPR, intellectual property right issues, could be a devaluation of the Chinese renminbi. There's many things is there. So whatever the Americans are pushing China to take, just what we need as neighboring countries of China. They should be the gap, international standard and China's standards, that gap should be narrowed. That's the way bring more formidable, good, stable situations in this region. As South Koreans, I have to say this. Thank you very much, and we'll continue discussions maybe at the lunchtime. Thank you. You give a big hand to all the presenters and the panelists.
Thank you, Greg.